The air in the camp was thick with suspicion, as if mistrust itself had been poured into the sky and left to hover above the rows of bamboo and wire. Women sat in silence, their faces pale from hunger, their bodies fragile outlines of what they had once been. Their eyes flicked nervously to the guards at the gate, and every whisper that passed from lip to lip carried the same refrain: "The Americans will starve us, break us, make us beg." Such was the prophecy whispered in villages before capture, planted in their minds by years of propaganda that painted the enemy as monsters in human skin. They had been told the Americans were cruel, that surrender meant degradation, that mercy was not in the vocabulary of the West. The women braced themselves for what they believed was inevitable: a diet of stale crusts, if anything at all, doled out with the indifference one gives to stray dogs. The memory of rice lingered like a ghost in their mouths, though months had passed since many had tasted a proper meal. Rice, salted fish, warm broth, all had belonged to another life, one that felt impossibly distant. Hunger had reshaped their bodies into fragile skeletons clothed in thin fabric. Their steps had slowed, their skin clung tight to their bones, and still, they clung to dignity with a tenacity that startled even themselves. To be given rotten scraps, they thought, would be a final insult, but at least it would confirm what they had been told, that the enemy was nothing but a brute in uniform. Among them was a young woman of 22, whose cheeks had hollowed into sharp angles. Her name was Yumi, and though no one said it aloud, she had become a kind of mirror for the group. When she sat silent and tense, others stiffened. When she allowed a rare smile to flicker, courage returned to their chests. Yumi carried in her pocket a piece of cloth torn from her mother's kimono, its faded cherry blossom pattern rubbed smooth by her fingers. It was a fragment of memory, and also of expectation, because she believed, as her mother had said, that the Americans would strip them of everything, even scraps of dignity. And so she held that cloth as if it alone might shield her from the humiliation to come. At night, the women spoke in whispers. Some imagined they would be forced to work until they collapsed, given only water or moldy rice husks. Others pictured long tables of stale bread, dry and tasteless, flung at them like insults. One woman, older and sterner than the rest, muttered, "If they want to kill us slowly, they will feed us bread. Bread that cracks the teeth, bread that fills the belly with emptiness." A murmur of agreement followed, and though no one had tasted such bread, the image stuck. In their minds, bread became a symbol not of nourishment, but of punishment, of alien strangeness, of submission to a foreign power. They imagined crusts as sharp as stone, each bite a reminder that they were prisoners, that they had fallen. But the first sign that their prophecy would not unfold as expected came not with sight, but with scent. One morning, as the sun tilted over the camp, the wind carried a fragrance that startled the women from their silence. It was rich, smoky, almost indecent in its fullness. It did not smell of decay or scraps. It smelled of meat, of pork roasting slowly, its fat crackling, releasing a sweetness into the air that was both foreign and intoxicating. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one woman, her voice trembling with both hope and fear, whispered, "It must be for the guards." Laughter followed, dry and bitter. Of course, it could not be for them. Not for prisoners. Not for Japanese women who had been told they were the enemy's shame. Yet the scent grew stronger, undeniable. Their stomachs twisted with hunger, their mouths watered against their will. The younger women, unable to resist, closed their eyes and breathed it in as if to swallow the smell itself. Yumi pressed her mother's cloth to her face, inhaling the faint cherry blossoms and the invasive pork smoke together, the past and present colliding in a single breath. It felt like betrayal to want it, to yearn for what surely was forbidden. Better to steel oneself for stale bread than to believe in the impossible. When the guards finally appeared, their boots crunching over gravel, the women stiffened. But instead of weapons raised or insults hurled, the Americans carried something else. Metal trays stacked high with bread, not stale or moldy, but fresh, its crust golden and steaming in the cool morning air. The smell of yeast mingled with the pork, creating a warmth that swept through the camp like an uninvited guest. One guard, barely older than Yumi, gave a sheepish smile as he set the trays down. Another whistled softly, almost cheerfully, as though delivering food were no different than setting the table at home. The prisoners stared in silence, suspicion carved deep into their faces. Surely this was a trick. Surely poison lurked beneath the soft crusts. The first loaf was broken open, and steam curled upward like incense from a shrine. The sound of crust cracking echoed faintly, as though the bread itself were shattering the walls built in their minds. A few women gasped. One reached out, her hand trembling, then drew it back as though the loaf might burn her skin. Yumi watched, her throat dry, her heart pounding in her ears. She remembered her mother's words, the warnings, the certainty that the Americans would feed them shame. Yet here was bread that looked like kindness, smelled like mercy. And still, she could not move. Hunger pulled her forward. Fear chained her back. A loaf was placed directly before her, the crust glistening, the interior as white as snow. Yumi did not lift her eyes. She touched the edge of it with one finger, felt the heat, and drew in a sharp breath. The bread was soft, alive with warmth, nothing like the stone she had been promised. Around her, others began to eat, hesitantly at first, then with the desperate hunger of those who had not believed such a moment possible. The sound of chewing filled the silence, mingling with faint sighs, even stifled sobs. Some women clutched their loaves as though they might vanish, as though this were all a cruel dream that might dissolve with the next breath. Yumi raised the bread to her lips, her hand shaking, her mother's cloth clutched tight in the other. She bit. The crust broke gently, the inside melted against her tongue, rich with flavor she could hardly comprehend. For an instant, she thought she might weep. Bread was not punishment. Bread was not shame. Bread was, impossibly, life. She swallowed, and something shifted inside her, something she could not yet name. Around her, women who had prepared for humiliation sat in stunned silence, their faces softening as if years of fear had been lifted in a single meal. They had expected stale bread and humiliation. Instead, they had been given warmth, softness, and mercy they did not understand. And though no one dared say it aloud, every woman in that camp knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The first days after the bread were not easier, only stranger. The women had braced for cruelty, yet found themselves facing a contradiction so sharp it left them unsettled. They were still prisoners, still surrounded by barbed wire and foreign voices barking orders, but their captors set tables instead of punishments. Each morning, the Americans brought out trays of food, and the sight was always the same: white bread, cut thick and soft, bowls of butter melting under the sun, and platters of meat whose juices glistened like something from a banquet. The women sat across from each other, bones jutting through thin skin, staring at meals that seemed too rich for war. To eat was to live, but to accept it was to admit the enemy was not the monster they had been promised. Yumi sat among them, the cloth from her mother still in her pocket, but she touched it less often now. She studied the bread, the pork, the bowls of beans and corn, and she felt the strangest sense of betrayal, not of her country, but of her own fear. It had prepared her for whips and starvation, yet here she was, with butter dripping down her fingers. Each bite was both comfort and torment. Her body devoured it greedily, but her mind recoiled, whispering, "This is a trap. No one feeds prisoners like this." Yet no punishment followed, only the occasional half-smile from a young guard who looked as though he might be her brother if born on the other side of the ocean. At first, the women ate quietly, their silence brittle. They chewed as though the act itself might expose them. But hunger was a tyrant, and it drowned out shame. Soon the camp echoed with the sound of chewing, of spoons scraping bowls, of bread tearing apart in eager hands. The contradiction deepened. This was a prison, yet their bellies filled for the first time in months. One woman, her hair streaked with gray, closed her eyes after swallowing and whispered, "This is not food. This is medicine." Her words struck something raw in the group, and several nodded, their faces damp with tears they tried to hide. The Americans themselves seemed baffled by the effect. They did not hover with malice, nor laugh at the women's desperate eating. Instead, they stood casually, as if waiting for their turn at the same meal. One even tapped his boot to an invisible tune, humming under his breath. It was absurd, almost comical. Prisoners expected cruelty. Instead, they received a guard whistling as if in his mother's kitchen. The irony cut sharper than a blade. Yumi, watching, almost laughed herself, though it was the kind of laughter born of disbelief, the kind that trembles close to tears. Statistics had no place in their minds, yet the reality was plain. Where once their rations had been scraps of spoiled rice, now they were served meals rich in calories. pork weighing ounces more than their frail hands could hold, bread baked fresh in ovens funded by Red Cross shipments, vegetables salted and boiled with care. The Americans kept records, of course. Each loaf counted, each portion measured to exceed the standards demanded by Geneva. But for the women, numbers did not matter. What mattered was the warmth spreading through their stomachs, the sudden flush of life returning to their cheeks. They could see it in one another, eyes brighter, postures less hunched, voices a little steadier. Hunger had hollowed them into shadows. Food began to sculpt them back into people. And yet suspicion lingered. To be fed so well by the enemy was disarming, unsettling. A few women whispered that perhaps it was a game of humiliation, that the Americans wanted them soft before striking. One murmured bitterly, "They fatten pigs before slaughter." The words silenced the table, and for a moment the food lost its taste. But then another woman, younger and braver than most, laughed softly and said, "If this is fattening, then let me be a pig. I would rather die with butter on my lips than starvation in my bones." The line carried through the room like a spark, and even Yumi allowed a small smile. Humor, brittle and shy, became another contradiction, laughter blooming in captivity. Yumi could not ignore the feeling that each meal chipped away at something larger than hunger. Bread and pork were not just nourishment, they were questions with no answers. Why kindness? Why generosity? Why the enemy acting like hosts instead of wardens? Her mother's cloth in her pocket reminded her of the warnings, of the certainty that Americans were merciless. Yet every bite of soft bread was a betrayal of that certainty, an unraveling of the story she had been raised to believe. She thought of home, of the faces of those still fighting, and wondered what they would say if they saw her now, eating like a guest at the table of her captors. One evening, as the sky bled orange and purple beyond the camp, the guards brought out not just bread and pork but something sweet. Slices of apple pie, steam curling from the crust. The women froze. The smell of cinnamon and sugar was almost too much to bear. Yumi stared, her mouth watering, her heart hammering. This was no prisoner's ration. This was celebration. The absurdity was unbearable. A camp of women who had prepared for starvation now sat staring at pie. Some laughed through their tears, others prayed softly under their breath. Yumi took a bite, and for a moment she thought she might vanish into the flavor, into the warmth that felt like forgiveness. Still, the conflict gnawed at her. To eat was to live, but to trust was to surrender. The Americans were enemies, yes, but also bakers, servers, men who whistled tunes while handing out food that tasted like mercy. The women ate, but their eyes darted, searching for the cruelty that must surely follow. Each meal became a riddle, each bite a paradox. Bread was supposed to be punishment, but it was salvation. Pork was supposed to be foreign, but it was comfort. And apple pie. Apple pie was something they could not yet name, something that blurred the line between captivity and humanity. As night fell, Yumi lay awake, the taste of cinnamon still on her tongue. She touched her mother's cloth but found no comfort in its faded blossoms. Her hunger was quiet now, but her heart beat with confusion. If the enemy could feed her like this, what else might he do? What else might be untrue? The contradictions stacked like stones in her mind, heavy and immovable, until one thought pushed through like a whisper she could not silence. Perhaps the greatest danger here was not hunger, but mercy itself. Propaganda is strongest when no rival truth exists. For years, Japanese women had been told the Americans were demons in human form, faces twisted by cruelty, hands eager to torment. Leaflets and speeches had painted them as defilers who knew nothing of honor, who would grind prisoners into dust without hesitation. Fear had been sharpened into armor, meant to protect their loyalty even in captivity. But armor cracks under hunger, and lies falter when the senses betray them. The first real feast in camp, bread, pork, beans, and even pie, was not merely a meal. It was a weapon far more subversive than any gun, because it cut at the root of everything they had been taught. The contradictions pressed harder each day. They had expected blows, yet they were offered plates. They had prepared for rotten husks, yet butter slid warmly across their tongues. Yumi, who once clutched her mother's cloth as proof of certainty, found her fingers resting there less often. Each bite weakened her grip on the story she had carried into captivity. She did not trust the Americans, not fully, but she could not deny the glow returning to her cheeks, the steadiness in her steps. Her reflection in a basin of water startled her. The eyes that had dulled to gray now caught glimmers of their old brown warmth. She wanted to believe food was only food, but in her bones she knew it was more than that. It was ideology dissolving, swallowed with each mouthful. Around her, the women changed too. Their voices grew louder at mealtimes, conversations blooming where once there had been only silence. Some spoke of home, of mothers and children, of flavors they remembered from their villages. Others admitted, in whispers, that they did not recognize their captors anymore. "They laugh too much to be monsters," one woman said as she licked a streak of gravy from her finger, embarrassed yet unashamed. Another murmured, "If this is captivity, what does freedom taste like?" Nervous laughter followed, but the question lingered in the air, heavier than barbed wire. The Americans themselves seemed almost casual in their kindness, and perhaps that was what made it so disarming. They did not perform generosity with ceremony. They handed over bread the way a man might hand an apple to a child, thoughtlessly, as though it were natural to share. One guard, tall and freckled, tried to learn a few words of Japanese, stumbling over the syllables as the women giggled despite themselves. He laughed too, unashamed, shaking his head at his own clumsiness. It was impossible to reconcile him with the ogre-like images stamped on wartime posters. Propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, but it had not prepared them for freckles and laughter. The impact reached beyond emotion. Bodies responded to nourishment with startling speed. Medical records from the camp later showed weight gain measured in pounds within weeks, anemia easing, skin returning to color. Numbers spoke a language too clear to ignore. Women who had hovered on the edge of collapse were walking upright again. Stomachs that had once shrunk to silence now growled impatiently at the smell of food. Strength returned, subtle at first, a steadier step, a louder voice, a face lifted toward the sun. Life crept back into the camp, disguised as pork fat and bread yeast. And yet the more they healed, the more dangerous the truth became. If the enemy was kind, what had the war been for? If the Americans could laugh with them, what did that say of the deaths, the firestorms, the sacrifices endured back home? The feast unsettled more than hunger. It unsettled identity. To accept the food was to accept that their leaders had lied, that cruelty had been exaggerated, that mercy was possible even in war. Some resisted the thought, clinging fiercely to suspicion. They ate but told themselves it was only strategy, that the enemy was softening them for some unseen cruelty. Others, braver or simply more weary, began to wonder if the world was not as simple as they had been told. One afternoon, as bread was passed down the long wooden table, a quiet argument broke out. An older woman hissed that they were fools, that every bite was betrayal, that their families at home would weep to see them eating so freely. A younger one, her cheeks rounder now with regained flesh, snapped back, "Would you rather starve to prove your loyalty? My family would prefer me alive." The clash was brief, but the silence that followed was sharper than any shout. Each woman wrestled with her own loyalty, her own survival, torn between what she had been told to believe and what her own senses screamed at her daily. Yumi said nothing. She sat with the bread in her hands, her thumb pressed to its crust. She thought of her mother's cloth, of the cherry blossoms faded nearly to white. She thought of the smell of pork that first morning, the steam rising like incense. And she thought of the freckled guard, fumbling through Japanese words with the patience of someone who saw her not as an enemy, but simply as another human being across the table. Something inside her shifted dangerously close to breaking. The propaganda had promised monsters. The table before her offered something far more confusing: humanity. The enemy's bread filled her stomach, but it also tore at her beliefs. Each meal was a battle fought not on fields but within hearts, where fear and truth collided. Yumi chewed slowly, tasting both the butter on her lips and the bitterness of betrayal in her chest. She did not know which flavor would last longer. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy quiet, the women spoke in hushed tones. Some prayed, some wept softly, some lay awake staring at the stars beyond the wire. Yumi listened, her own stomach heavy with food, her mind heavy with questions. She could still taste apple pie, its sweetness lingering like a memory she could not escape. She realized with a shiver that propaganda had cracked, not with a gunshot, but with cinnamon and sugar. And though no one dared speak it aloud, the women felt the same dangerous truth. The most powerful feast in the camp was not what filled their plates, but what it was breaking inside them. Tomorrow, they would sit again at the table, and the contradictions would only deepen. The final weeks of captivity unfolded with a rhythm no one had anticipated. The women rose at dawn, not to the crack of whips or the rattle of chains, but to the scent of bread pulled from ovens, its crust darkened to gold, its steam curling into the air like an invitation. Pork roasts turned on spits, fat dripping into flames with a hiss that sounded more like celebration than punishment. The meals came day after day, and what began as suspicion slowly evolved into ritual. Yet beneath the steady routine of eating and living, a quieter revolution stirred. The walls inside the women, walls built of fear, of propaganda, of grief, were beginning to splinter. Yumi felt it most acutely. She had carried her mother's cloth through every stage of hunger and fear, but now when her fingers brushed its faded blossoms, it no longer steadied her. Instead, it reminded her of the gulf between what she had been told and what she had seen. The Americans did not sneer as they served food. They did not strike her when she faltered, nor strip her of dignity when she reached for seconds. They acted with the weary patience of men fulfilling a duty, and in their very ordinariness lay the most dangerous truth. They were not demons, only people. To admit this was to betray the certainty she had inherited, and yet her body betrayed her every time she swallowed the warmth of buttered bread. Betrayal had never tasted so merciful. The camp itself reflected the change. Women who once sat hunched and silent now laughed during meals, their voices hesitant at first, then bolder. They teased each other over who ate fastest, who asked sheepishly for another slice of pork. Some even dared to mimic the guards' awkward attempts at Japanese, their giggles chasing away the long shadows of fear. The barbed wire still stood, sharp and unyielding, but inside the enclosure, another kind of barrier was breaking. Hope crept in with each calorie, uninvited but unstoppable. One afternoon, rain began to fall, a slow drizzle that turned the dirt into mud and the air into a cool balm. The guards set up tables under canvas, and the women sat dripping wet, their hair plastered to their faces, laughing at the absurdity of eating pie in a storm. Yumi bit into a slice of bread, its crust soft from the damp, and realized she was laughing too, her voice mingling with theirs. She caught the eye of the freckled guard, who shook water from his cap and shrugged as if to say, "What can we do but eat?" In that moment, the divide between them seemed paper-thin, flimsy enough to tear with one pull. Yet even as bonds grew, guilt gnawed at them. For every loaf consumed, a shadow whispered of home, of families still starving, of soldiers still fighting. At night, some wept silently, ashamed that they were fed so well while loved ones suffered. Yumi felt the weight of this contradiction in her chest. To live was its own act of defiance, but to live on the enemy's generosity was a paradox that burned like salt in an open wound. She often lay awake, clutching the cloth, wondering if her mother would forgive her for accepting what she had been told to despise. The climax came not with bread, but with a wall, one of rusting metal that enclosed the camp's edge. It was not high, but it loomed, a symbol of everything dividing captors from captives. One morning, after a shipment of supplies arrived, the guards pushed extra crates of bread and pork against that wall. Then, to the astonishment of the women, they unlocked the gate, not to release prisoners, but to share. On the other side stood villagers displaced by the war, ragged and hungry. Without ceremony, the Americans carried loaves and meat through the gap, handing them not only to the prisoners but to the villagers as well. The food crossed boundaries, passed from guard to prisoner to stranger. In that instant, the wall ceased to be a barrier. It became a table, stretched wide enough to hold enemies and allies alike. Yumi held her loaf tightly, staring at the villagers' gaunt faces as they accepted pieces from her own hands. She had imagined Americans as tormentors, herself as victim, villagers as outsiders. Yet here they were, all of them fed by the same bread, bound by the same hunger, soothed by the same warmth. The propaganda that had once sounded unshakable now felt absurd, dissolved in the simplicity of sharing. She no longer needed her mother's cloth to remind her of the past. She had something heavier, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous, the memory of mercy. When the women returned to their barracks that night, silence filled the room. No one spoke of betrayal or loyalty. No one argued about what the Americans intended. Instead, they sat with the echo of what had happened, each woman haunted by the same revelation. Walls, whether of barbed wire or ideology, were only as strong as the hunger that sustained them. Bread had softened those walls, pork had cracked them, and the act of sharing had broken them clean through. Yumi lay on her mat, her eyes wide open in the dark. She thought of the bread steam rising into the rain, of villagers' hands reaching out, of guards standing shoulder to shoulder with prisoners. She thought of how easily truth had been hidden, and how quickly it had unraveled the moment kindness was tasted. The cloth in her pocket was no longer her anchor but a relic, a reminder of how fear had once bound her. Now she understood something larger, something terrifying and liberating. Mercy itself could be more revolutionary than victory. And as sleep finally tugged at her, she knew the war outside the camp was still raging, but inside, something greater had already been won. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.